So this is a little summary of what I've learned from Robert Sapolsky's book Behave about how our brain actually responds to the size of our social group. I just want to make it clear that I am not an expert in this subject. I am just summarizing whatever Robert Sapolsky has written in his book Behave, maybe something from his book Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers, and also his lectures on YouTube, which were streamed from his Stanford class. So really interesting stuff. So I'm going to read some things here. The larger the size of someone's social network, often calculated by the number of email texting relationships, the larger the ventromedial prefrontal cortex and the amygdala, and the better the person's theory of mind-related skills are. So what this means is that if you are texting a lot of people, if you are emailing a lot of people, particularly over the size of Dunbar's number, which is 150 people, which is the size of our social groups as we are in tribes. If you're doing more than that, you're essentially rewiring your brain. And somebody might object to this and say, well, maybe it's just people with an already large prefrontal cortex, ventral medial prefrontal cortex, already have that complex wiring, but and that it's not something that you can actually train. But then scientists actually went in, and here I'll read another thing. Among some primates, oh no, that's not it. Yeah. Sociality is more complex in fission-fusion species. You must remember if someone's ranks differs when in a subgroup versus the entire group, being away from someone all day makes it tempting to see if dominance relations have changed since breakfast. One study compared fission-fusion primates, chimps, bonobos, orangutans, spider monkeys, and non-fission-fusion gorillas, capuchins, long-tailed macaques. Among these captive animals, fission-fusion species were better at frontocortical tasks and had larger neocortices relative to brain size. That isn't actually the study I wanted, but essentially the study that I wanted. Yes, okay. Among some primates, a group size can vary tenfold, depending on the richness of the ecosystem. This was modeled in a fascinating neuroimaging study in which captive macaque monkeys were housed in different sized groups. The bigger the group, the more thickening of the prefrontal cortex and of the superior temporal gyrus, a cortical region involved in theory of mind, and the tighter the activity coupling between the two. What that means is that essentially you can train this, at least if you're a monkey. So you've got to give some sort of skeptical nature of this as well. But you can train how big this ventral medial prefrontal cortex is. The ventral medial prefrontal cortex is like right here, deep in below. And it's part of the prefrontal cortex. So it's part of this kind of outgrowth here, which is also very related to our hands and our ability to manipulate tools and also language. And then some other interesting thing is it's very intimately tied up with sociality. So the ventral medial cortex is also the seat of our gut feeling and our ability, and that gut feeling is intimately tied to social relationships. You don't really feel that gut feeling about a plant or about a cup. You feel that about other people. And emotions are highly tied to our sociality as well. So what is the function of this? What is the use of this? I'm doing this particular live stream because I was having a conversation with Tyler Tringus, and we were talking about email, and he's an investor, so he's involved in a lot of different emails, a lot of different communications with a large amount of people. I am doing the same thing with the podcast. I'm interacting with way more than 150 people for my podcast. It's a large group of people, and I can feel my brain changing. I can feel my brain rewiring. I can feel my brain getting better at social relationships. I can feel it better at analyzing social relationships. And another important thing to bring up here, which Jordan Peterson talks a lot about, Robert Sapolsky talks a lot about, is that primates, maybe all of life, is in a hierarchy, and so our ability to see the hierarchy is sometimes distant from our ability to abstractly understand that with our cognitive minds. So as an example, Robert Sapolsky uses, if you start messing with the dynamics of a hierarchy inside of a primates, there will be stress and tension among all the primates. But it's not like the primates actually can talk about it and say, oh, this is happening. Like, oh, that guy who was on top is now on the bottom and something's happening. I don't really know my place in the hierarchy. But they just feel stress. You don't need to know that you're feeling stress to feel stress. It's what's called an autonomic process. Your brain just recognizes without you in control. This is a thing that I find a lot of people having trouble with, is that they don't understand that this thing that's speaking for me right now, this verbal semantic understanding, the rationalization, that rationalization is not very smart. It's not a very intelligent thing. It is compared to primates. But its primary job is to rationalize our behavior after we've already done it. There is some sense of strategy or thinking into the future as well. There is that component, but a lot of times it's just a rationalization. It's not accurate. Because how can you be accurate about reality? If you think that you have an accurate image of how reality works, I would highly, highly recommend you to inquire into that and understand that reality is far more vast than your rationalization, your prediction mechanism can get into. Going into quite a tangent here. Got a couple more minutes left, but one thing that is not in Robert Sapolsky, is not in any other thing, but something that's helped me is just thinking about it as a game where you're trying to grow your brain, particularly this ventromedial prefrontal cortex, by having a large social network and understanding the nodes in that social network, understanding how you might help them, how they might help you, and just being in this kind of understanding that, like, that person that you talked to last week has this problem. And there's also another tool that you can use to do this called spaced repetition memorization software. So you can put somebody's face on a card and then test yourself on their name by hiding the name and then showing the name. Two good ones are Anki and MemoSign. They're not actually that good. I've been using MemoSign for the last 4 years. I'm not using it for the facial recognition because I found that that's just a product of that I've gotten better at as a product of doing the podcast. It's also really good for learning semantic knowledge, verbal knowledge. So if you want to learn a new language, I'm using it for learning biology because biology has a lot of new terms. And if I can understand these terms, I can get deeper and deeper into a better mental model of how biology actually works. So yeah, you can use the spaced repetition by testing yourself on people's names and also what their problems are. But it's also just good to ask yourself questions like, or ask other people questions about what problems they're focused on and how you can help. So hopefully this answers the question and gave you some interesting ways to think about having a larger social network, because now we are in a time where we are not in 150 people. We deal with a lot more than that, particularly if you're an investor, or particularly if you're running a podcast, or particularly if you're interviewing a bunch of people or in a large organization. So it's just something to think about, that it's not necessarily stuck that way. Our brains are plastic. They are very plastic. And you can do a lot of things in order to maintain that plasticity. Meditation, psychedelics, therapy, all of these things will kind of allow you to get some more plasticity and get out of the ruts that our brains tend to put us in. Actually, I'm not sure it's our brains put us in. I think society puts us in, and also emotional trauma puts us in. So hopefully this was helpful. Please find me on Twitter at Stuart Alsop III if you're interested in learning more about this stuff. I tweet about this stuff, and I tweet about a lot of other different stuff. And I'm speaking really fast right now to try to get all of this into this 10 minutes. But hopefully you found it valuable, and find me on Twitter. I'd love to hear what you think.